Okay, great, thanks. So I'm hoping this talk is going to fit pretty well with what Mark was talking about because um, what I'm really going to focus on today is an idea that a lot of scientists have been uh, keyed into, which is that we not only need to think about the wildfire problem, but the fact that with the changes in disturbance regimes and with climate change, there are more things coming down the pike at our forests than just fire alone. And the concept that's often put out there is one of resilience. How can we make our forests be able to kind of get through a whole range of different disturbances? And that's exactly what resilience is about. And so I'm going to talk today about an attempt to define it, particularly for Western frequent fire forests, and particularly using a bunch of data from the Sierra Nevadas. And I think it has some interesting implications for what we might be thinking about and the way we want to treat these forests and what we want to do. So,
Yeah.
so oh, can you hear me still? Um, um, so to operationalize resilience, the reason why I'm focused on this is that for many years, I think a lot of times what we were trying to do with forest treatments is take the forest back to something of what it used to look like before the arrival of Europeans, in which it was both by photos and from data sets and from accounts and narratives, a fairly open forest conditions dominated by really large trees. But as we know, with changing climate conditions, we're in what's called a non-stationary situation in which trying to rewind the clock to a previous time or condition is pretty risky, if not kind of foolhardy, because the climate is changing, the disturbance regimes are changing, and we can't simply go back in time to something that's probably very difficult to achieve. So with that said, I think a lot of the effort now is to try to hedge our bets and say, let's make the forest able to respond or be able to rebound, be resilient to a range of different stresses. And that's certainly embedded in the language that the Forest Service uses in its planning rule, which it passed in 2012, as well as CAL FIRE's efforts and the task force, the governor's task force, in its focus on resilience as well. The problem is that resilience has been really difficult to define. And when I first started working on this paper, I was like, oh my God, now I got to read those 500 different papers all trying to define resilience and put it into scope. And there are different definitions of resilience depending on whether you're an engineer, a civiculturalist, an ecologist. There's no set scale at which it's applied to. The terms itself are pretty rubbery, and they often overlap a lot between resistance, response, and resilience. And as many ecologists have pointed out, there's no one size that's going to fit all, as resilience is going to vary between ecosystems. And so I think an article in 2007 kind of nailed it pretty well, which is they said resilience was a malleable term that facilitates communication across disciplinary boundaries by creating shared vocabulary, bridging the gap between science and policy. Well, that sounds good, but it makes it basically almost useless in terms of a scientific measure that you can actually apply out in the world to judge whether something is resilient or not. And I know that this response has been really widely shared, not only amongst the science community, but amongst managers who've been tasked with making forests resilient. And they're just kind of shaking their head. What the hell does that mean? And how do I do it? So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is an effort to try to nail this thing down, like kind of like nailing Jello to the wall and seeing if we can actually bring it to some kind of coherent measurement standard. So bear with me. I'm gonna take two different prongs here in how to identify and define resilience. One of them is going to be conceptual, building on quite a bit of pretty solid theory in the field of ecology. And then the second part, which I think you'll find a little bit more tangible, is looking at a historical data set of what these forests used to look like, and really looking at the numbers and what they tell us about the way this system works. So if we're trying to like give some form to this Jello and make it useful, one place to start is saying, how is fire in these systems considered? What is it thought like, or what is it compared to? And in ecology, fire is treated very similarly to what herbivory does in a system. So if you look on the right-hand side, there's a kind of a classic picture of a whole bunch of zebras and wildebeests, not in California, but in Africa. And what herbivory does in a system like this is the consumers, i.e. the ungulates or the zebra and wildebeest, are basically controlling the biomass in the ecosystem and what species are out there. Because when predators are scarce, so if you take the lions out of the picture, like in the top photo, you end up with a tremendous proliferation of herbivores, all those zebras and wildebeests. And they browse the grass down to a level at which it's not competition for resources that's mattering in what's out there and how dense the grass is. It's the herbivores themselves, because they're a top-down control on what the biomass is and the species composition is like out there. They're grazing the system down to a very low level. How does this apply to fire systems? Well, fire is believed to do the same kind of thing. So in the absence of suppression, which is the same thing as if you made predators scarce in the system, fire proliferates in it. And it is the frequent controlling force in the system which limits tree density and what species you have out there more than resource availability. So normally we think of competition for water, light, and nutrients as the thing that is determining what's going on in the system. But if fire is coming through and cleaning out the forest all the time, then actually what's controlling the biomass and the arrangement of the ecosystem is the fire itself. And how it's doing that is it is burning the system back enough to significantly reduce competition. So an interesting analog to this is if we look at some of the historical information about the early surveys in California, what the forests were like. To most foresters looking and surveying Western forests, these forests would have looked really understocked. They would have been really wide open. And there's a pretty nice quote from an early survey in 1902 in Northern California by a guy named Lieberg, did a very extensive survey of forest conditions. And he has this quote from that that says, "The suppression of the young growth has always been one of the serious results of fire. The land does not carry more than 35% of the quantity of timber it is capable of supporting." Of course, he's surveying the forest for timber, but note that he's saying that basically fire is reducing that level of timber, or I'm going to call it more biomass in the system, to only about 35% of its potential. So how does this fit into what we're currently seeing in modern forests? Well, one of the things that ecologists also consider when they're looking at stresses and how well a system rebounds or how resilient it is a kind of a basic distinction between, is a stress a press or is it a pulse? A pulse is something that comes in briefly, exudes stress on in this case, the trees, but doesn't last very long. A press is something that is continual, that is there constantly pushing away at the trees in the system, creating a continual type of pressure or stress on them. And I think that that's what we're basically seeing in these forests, which helps to explain why forests that we know and we've sampled that live for 400 or 500 years and have been able to grow and persist through stresses in the past, such as drought and bark beetle outbreaks and surface fires that came into the system. Why are these very long-lived trees all of a sudden dying in modern times sometimes with very little stress put to them, or sometimes without even any stress that we put on them, but it's simply drought or bark beetles. Why are those trees that have been so resistant to be able to get through these stresses, why are they dying now at times? And the difference, it seems to me, in this condition is that the stress is not a pulse that simply goes away. It is a constant press on the system, and that is the nature of competition in these systems. And if you think about a forest that evolves with a certain set of conditions, its evolutionary history is not going to predispose the trees in that forest to deal with a continuous type of press, which is what competition is doing to them. And it can help explain why sometimes when we treat forests to try to make them, restore them and make them more resilient, we sometimes kill the very trees that we're trying to hold on to, the big trees. And you go, why? I mean, that tree persisted for 400 or 500 years through all sorts of droughts in the past and all sorts of fire, and yet it just died now. And certainly this idea that competition is the thing that is making these trees really weakened and very susceptible to these type of stresses brings together a lot of both research as well as this kind of conceptual idea about the way these systems evolve with either presses or pulse type of stresses to them. One last kind of defining thing before I launch into some of the more data, well, some of the more historical data, which I think will make this easier to understand, is there's been a lot of confusion in the literature about resistance versus resilience. And so within the context of this study, and I think hopefully what's useful to our discussion today, is I would consider resistance as what we are often doing when we do fuels reduction treatments. We are picking a particular stress, crown fire or high intensity fire, and reducing the fuels in the forest to try to ensure that the large trees, the overstory trees, survive this type of condition or this kind of press. And that's a resistance type of treatment. It's designed for a specific stress and designed for a specific response, i.e. the big overstory trees to get through the system. Resilience, which is what I'm focusing on here, is a more ambitious condition that you're trying to get to the forest to, which it has to be adaptable to a whole range of stresses, not just fire, has to be adaptable to be able to deal with drought, bark beetles, wind events, a whole host of things that can either kill trees or at least stress them significantly. And resilience is keyed on not simply getting the large overstory trees to survive, but trying to get the forest to be able to restore its function, its ecosystem processes. And that is the functional integrity that resilience is going after. So in this case, I'm going to propose that the hypothesis is that resilience treatments, which are going to be more intensive than simply reducing fuels, if they're going to work, they need to restore the tree vigor by creating very low densities that we had in the past that were characterized by little resource competition. And that's the key of what we're going to talk about. And I'm going to suggest that we actually have a pretty good tool for being able to measure or assess that level of competition, which is called relative stand density index. I'm going to explain what that SDI or stand density index is here with this next slide. This is kind of a very brief shorthand definition of stand density index, but I hope it kind of hits on the points of what is going on when we're taking this measure of SDI. It's a measure in a forest that combines the number of trees, the density of the trees per acre, and their size, measured by diameter, to assess what the total biomass is of that forest that you're standing in. The relative SDI is an assessment of that local stand biomass that you're standing in the middle of compared to the maximum that that particular type of forest could carry if it were uninterrupted by fire or anything else. It's kind of like, it's very similar to the idea of carrying capacity. It's like, how much woody biomass could you pack onto that system until it basically crashed? And there are different maximums depending on which type of forest you're talking about, whether it's Jeffrey pine or mixed conifer. But when you're standing within a Jeffrey pine forest and you have a measurement of SDI, you compare it to what the maximum level is that a Jeffrey pine forest could carry. Why is this useful and why should we focus on it? Because it's been used for a long period of time and has been proven to be pretty robust in measuring how crowded or how open forests are. It basically assesses how much competition there is between trees and how fast or how vigorously they're growing. In open stands that have very little competition, trees are growing rapidly, and we measure that by looking at the ring, the size of the rings, the increase in the rings, which you can see in this right-hand photo. That is a very good indicator of their growth or vigor. And frankly, we know from a whole bunch of work that's been done on this that that vigor is probably the best defense that a tree can get in terms of being able to deal with a whole variety of stresses: fire, drought, bark beetles, and climate change. And I've got a little diagram there showing a good growth here, which has got a big separation between the two adjacent rings. That the tree grew a lot in that year, and that has been clearly shown to be providing the tree with enough strength, basically enough water and growth rates, to be able to deal with bark beetles. And what it does when bark beetles attack a tree like that is it entombs them in pitch, and that's what the little reddish whitish ball is on the right hand side. That's just one example. There's similar ones in terms of trees being able to deal with drought and being able to deal with fire best when they have that really rapid and vigorous tree growth. So let's move beyond the theory stage and let's take a look at the historical forests and ask, would they have fulfilled or would they have been consistent with this idea of an environment with very little competition in it? Fortunately, in California, we're in luck with some really extensive surveys, timber surveys that were done on west side forests, west side of the Sierra forests back in the early part of the century. And I particularly pulled out and used two that are some of the best we know of because they're incredibly intensive. They're these little quarter sections, QQs, that are these boxes you're seeing in the upper right-hand side in the maps of these two different forests. I won't go into all the detail of it, but you basically are dealing with 640 plus samples covering an area of more than 10,000 hectares or about 25,000 acres in which every single tree has been measured. And it gives us a really good sense of not only what forests were like in a place, but forests were like really extensively distributed over large areas in both the Stanislaus and the Sequoia National Forest. And we also have tools nowadays in which we can take the exact same locations and look at the current forest conditions. And in this case, we used conditions from 2011 because it was 100 years after the first survey, and use the assessment of current forest conditions, which are a combination of different methods, LIDAR, FIA, and field plots that are combined together to give you an assessment of current forest conditions. And the bottom photo shows, besides a very stylish car down there at the base of the pine trees, shows this forest really transitioning in 1941 from a stand that would have been very open, dominated by large pines, as you can see in the center of that photo, to something that is getting filled in by a whole bunch of trees that have come in with fire exclusion. And that's what's filling in the other parts of that photo. So now I'm going to pick on the sheet just because it's fun. No, I'm going to pick on the sheet. Actually, I'm going to thank the sheet first because I do want to say that it gave me an opportunity to talk about some of the reservations that some of the environmental community has had with forest treatments. And we haven't run into too much of that on the east side of the Sierras, but it's a very vocal type of challenge and often litigation to some of these projects, fuels treatments projects on the west side of the Sierras. And there's particularly a person named Chad Hansen who wrote an op-ed piece in the Fresno Bee, which was reprinted in the sheet. The irony, just so I'll clear any mistakes or things about this, is Chad Hansen was one of my students. I was his major professor at Davis, and we definitely do not see eye to eye. But he is a very vocal person at bringing up some of the environmental community's reservations about fuels treatments. So this gives me a chance to kind of quickly go through some of these, and I'll let you assess as to whether you think the arguments are valid that he's bringing up or not. But they're ones that you see time and time and time again. A friend of mine who's an attorney in the OGC, Office of Government Counsel, has dealt with numerous litigation suits by Chad Hansen, and these are pretty much the core arguments that are often made when challenging fuels treatments. So one of the things that this op-ed piece says is that the study promotes removing 80% of the trees through commercial logging. I think that would be news to most any of us involved in this project, because we know how damn expensive it is to actually treat these forests, because we're leaving the large trees behind and removing the small trees. Many times this costs somewhere between $1,000 and $2,000 an acre. So you're certainly not making money. It's not a commercial logging situation. In fact, you're having to spend a hell of a lot of money to be able to thin the forest out and remove the fuels. Another thing interesting about Chad, since he knows me pretty well, was that his comment, the study was authored by scientists funded by the US Forest Service that financially benefits from commercial logging. Well, I'm the only one who's fully employed by the US Forest Service. Brandon Collins is half-time, although he's actually positioned at Berkeley. But out of 6 authors, then you have only at best 25% of them part of the Forest Service. And anyone who is familiar with my relationships with the Forest Service knows that I spend most of my time in the Forest Service woodshed, challenging them on various things that they don't want to hear about. So it's kind of entertainingly that I could be a shill for the timber industry and the Forest Service in the process of this. And even if I were, there's 5 other authors on this paper. The study used 2011 to represent current conditions and failed to mention these forests have now almost entirely burned. Again, a very typical argument. For some reason, I guess Chad and the others were not able to figure out that 2011 we used was because it was exactly 100 years after the first survey in 1911. And I have no idea what the point is that these forests, his point is that the forests have burned. I don't know what that influence is on, but it generally tends to show that they burned at pretty high intensity and were pretty fuel loaded. Then I've just kind of put in here briefly a bunch of arguments that are cited again and again and again. And Mark could probably cite these in his sleep because they're almost always used to challenge any one of the forest plans that are coming out. I'll let you decide as to whether you think these things make sense or not. Denser forests burn at lower intensity. I guess he must not have a wood stove or a fireplace where if you put more fuel in it, it tends to burn hotter. Logging increases fire intensity by changing the microclimate. Removing trees will not curb fire intensity, and promotes, or he claims that the North article promotes the misleading notion of overgrown Sierra Nevada forests. I guess the forests are not overgrown that are up and down the Sierras. Why did North study conceal all of this important information from the public? It's because the research that he's quoting here is all authored by 3 people, Chad Hansen, Dominic DeLaSalle, and Bill Baker. And that their work has been repeatedly rebutted by the science community time and time again, to the point where most of us do not have a lot of patience for this kind of stuff. But it does not mean that it goes away. Ecological Applications, one of the more reputable journals in the field, recently had a forum in which they had 3 articles systematically going through every one of these claims. And on those articles were more than 50 scientists who are both forest and fire ecologies, the leading people in most of these fields. And let me tell you, trying to get 50 scientists together is about as effective as herding cats. The only way you can get that many people together on one paper is to have really pissed them off. And this group has pissed off these people for many, many decades. So I don't want to pick on the sheet. Well, I am picking on the sheet, but I think that it's good to be aware of these arguments because they come up time and time again when we're talking about fuels treatments and when we're talking about this effort to reduce wildfire intensity. So to give you a sense of what historical conditions look like versus current, and I think this certainly sheds a fair amount of light on the Hansen arguments, is if you look at the top histograms, the graphs up there, they're divided into 3 different forest types: pine mixed conifer, xeric mixed conifer, and mesic mixed conifer. And the height of each one of those bars tells you how many trees there are per hectare. I'm sorry, this is in metric because of the journal it was published in. But a couple things to look at here besides, I mean, if you just look at the 2 photos on the right-hand side, you'll basically see what's happening in these forests, not only in the forest we're comparing, but basically what happened up and down the Sierras. You have a density, and I put the number of the density and the size of the trees in the upper right-hand corner. So if you look at conditions in 1911, you'll see that most of those, actually all 3 of those forest types had somewhere between about 47 to 72 of these stems per hectare. You divide about that by 2.5 to get down to acres. So you can see that you're talking about anywhere from like 20 to 30 trees per acre that used to be in these forests historically. And they averaged about 70 to 75 centimeters. That's about 30 inches roughly, or 66 to 75 centimeters. If you look at the bottom, it's the exact same locations, the same plots, but looked at in 2011. And the first thing to point out is that the range on the y-axis is 10 times what it is on the upper row of graphs. You're looking at stem densities in particular size classes that are often around 200 stems per acre. And you look at again at these bottom figures and you see that the density in the forests have gone up about 6 to 7 times what they used to be. And the average tree size has, as you would guess, when you've got a lot of small trees that come in, has shrunk to about half of the size, or about 15 inches in diameter, typical size of the tree. And just to give you some sense of this, the objection of removing 80% of the stems in modern forests would basically be analogous to a commercial logging sale or a clear cut. If you look at that right-hand box, 80%, removing 80% of the stems of the forest is basically taking out the small trees that are 13 to an average of 38 centimeters in diameter. And 38 centimeters is about, I'm terrible at English, I think it's about 15 inches in diameter. So you're taking out the trees below 15 inches in diameter, which, as you can see from that that upper right-hand photo, were extremely rare to almost non-existent in active fire forest conditions. What does this mean in terms of the change in the competitive environment? This is where the SDI comes into play here. And don't worry too much about all the numbers that are being thrown out here, but the way civiculturalists, forest managers view this is looking at the relative SDI, which is the amount of biomass in the stand that you're standing in compared to the maximum amount that that particular forest type could carry. And look at these graphs on the right-hand side for each one of the forest types. We call them violin plots, but basically they show the distribution of where these different forest plots were in terms of this relative SDI. The left-hand side of these, the 1911, are all showing distributions heavily in the 25 to at maximum about 35% of relative SDI, as the modern conditions are inverted. They're flipped over so that almost all the stands are distributed in the 60% to 100% distribution of relative SDI. What does it mean? It's simply a way of showing pretty conclusively that in 1911, about 3/4 to 4/5 of the forest was free of competition to just having very low or partial levels of competition, compared to the modern forest where 80 to 90% of the forest is in full competition to actually what we call the zone of imminent mortality, which means that you're above 60% and trees start dying because they've competed with each other to the point of basically thinning themselves out. So what does this mean? I mean, resilient forests historically were low density with little competition. So what? The reason why it's an important so what is that the way we manage forests currently has everything to do with competition. It's the way that civiculturalists and forest managers influence what trees are out there, the size of those trees, what the stocking density level is. And in the models where we're trying to figure out what the growth and yield of forests are going to be like, they are run in the background by this SDI value. It determines basically how trees thin themselves out and the sizes that they get to. I don't want to go into too much length about it, but it really suggests that current forestry practices may be misaligned with creating resilience. And in particular, one of the things which is commonly used is this relative SDI of 35%. Is the minimum level that modern managed forests are kept at. They're kept between 35 and 60%. And this data set and others are suggesting that the 35%, rather than being a floor, should actually be a ceiling for the way the forest should be. It should be much, much reduced in terms of density so that you are eliminating most of the competition going on. And I have a sentence in here talking about that at least currently the Forest Service in Region 5, if it used a 60% threshold, would end up treating only 48, 25, or 0% of these plots that we were evaluating in pine, xeric, and mesic mixed conifers, because the criteria for having it over 60% means that you don't end up treating that much of the forest. But if you were to treat forests to minimize competition, those levels of needing to treat the percentage of the landscape would increase to 91 to 100% for these different forest types. The reason why it matters is that we're really trying to say that there's a very important triage, absolutely essential stage in which we focus on fuels and deal with the wildfire problem. Because if we don't deal with that, we're not going to have all that much forest. A lot of it will get type converted to other things. But that is the immediate game. The longer term game is that there are many more stresses coming at these forests with climate change, where they need to be resilient to a host of these stresses that could be drought, bark beetles, fire, any types of things. And what this paper is suggesting, and what I think we have pretty strong evidence for now, is that if you want to hedge your bets and make those large trees survive to this very stressful, uncertain future, you need to be actually reducing density in these stands much lower than we're currently doing when we're simply focusing on fuels reduction and trying to keep crown fire out of the tops of the trees. I particularly want to end on this one last point, which is that many people might respond to this and say, okay, well, let's just separate the trees as much as possible. There's very good evidence from a lot of work that suggests that the spatial pattern of trees matters. And when we create forests that are basically pines and lines that are kind of crops of trees all regularly spaced like corn crops, it makes the forest much less resilient to wildfire. And so even though we're talking about dramatically reducing the density in these forests, we want to make sure that we're still creating this gappy, clumpy type of pattern that you can see in the bottom right from a great photo from Mark. That really shows the way fire creates this more complex spatial pattern that really increases the forest's resistance to wildfire when it does burn. And I'll stop there. And thank you very much for listening to me, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Malcolm, so much. I deliberately let these guys give their whole talks, and because I always build little time into the agenda just purposefully for that. So I'm happy to take a couple questions, but we're going to need to move relatively quickly to get through the rest of our stuff, so we can cover everything. But any questions for Malcolm while we've got him here? We're a big opportunity for folks. Maybe you scared him.
Maybe I scared him, or maybe it'll save time so we can you can get to the rest of the meeting topics.
Haley, go ahead, Haley.
Hi, Dr. Noor. Thank you so much. Yeah, this was more a, let's say, broader question, also relating to what Mr. Meyer was speaking about as well. And I'm a PhD student with a non-scientific background, so I'm just, kind of tapping my, or dipping my toes into these topics. But if I understand correctly, that forest restoration in your definition would mean a kind of return to a previous healthier version of the forest. How would that work with resilience, which I'm understanding as a adaptive and context-specific concept? So system functionality would respond to a particular point in time, but not necessarily trying to return to a previous state. So just kind of curious about like the relationship between these two concepts.
Yeah, it's a great question. And what I'm trying to do, because I didn't have the time to go into the background of it, but the reason for using the historical data sets and the focus on it is not to like slavishly say, okay, they had 8 large trees per acre, and that's exactly what we need to have, and we'll be fine if we get there. It's to use that information to say, we may not want to exactly match that forest, but we can use it to learn how the forest was put together, how it was interacting. And that's really what this effort is trying to go beyond simply saying, let's lower fuels to so many tons per acre, or let's make sure that we only have 8 large trees per acre, whatever. It's trying to dive into the processes below the surface that we're driving the system, because even if we end up with warmer temperatures, a new climate, different levels of stress that are coming into the system, it's important for us to know what that characteristic is and what was kind of driving it, what made the forest able to resist these stresses in the past. And what I'm suggesting here is it's competition. And if we're going to try to reduce competition, we're going to really have to reduce the density in the forest. And we don't need to magically or slavishly say, oh, if we look at 1911, we can figure out exactly how many trees to have. But what I am suggesting is that it says to us, hey, there's something here that made these forests really able to deal with all of these stresses in the past. And that has lessons for us. And to me, that lesson is, let's try to create forests that have very low levels of competition, because then I think we can hedge our bets and deal with fires that are going to be different, droughts that are going to be different than they were in 1911 or in the 1850s.
Yeah, great. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate both Dr. Meyer and North for taking time to present today. I would love to spend just the rest of the afternoon asking questions. But what I'm hope we can do is harness sort of some of this information and build off it through the outreach and education work that we're going to be doing this summer through a series of maybe more fun and interpersonal type events. So it's not the last you'll hear about this work, and I'm hoping we can build off of it for the purposes of this project. So with that,